fucking hell. Fucking high blood pressure, boys. High blood pressure. I'm having to quit the monster, innit? It's fucking terrible. Alright then. Social constructs. What the fuck is bro waffling about? What are you saying, mate? If I'm wearing a dress, I'm a fucking girl? Yeah, I guess. First section. Tits, money, and power. Okay, so this section's sort of a cheeky recap of what a social construct is. So if you're already super fucking enlightened and intelligent and handsome, etc., just skip to that section. So, when someone says X is a social construct, gender is a social construct, money is a social construct, what the fuck are they on about? Well, it means social, meaning collective, group, society, etc., and construct, to build shit. Society has constructed a thing. It's very descriptive in that way. Tits, money, and power are socially constructed. What are you on about, mate? Money's real. Look at my Bugatti. You're poor. My Jaffa cake-induced tits are very real, I'll have you know. Look at my tits and bank account. Okay, but why is money valuable? Well, because if I give it to people, they give me things. They give me Bugattis. And why do those people think money is valuable? Well, because they are accepting it and the understanding that other people will give them things when they give it them. The perceptions of the people are what creates its value. We could use other things as a representation of value, so why don't we? In fact, why do we even need a universalized store of value? I don't know, brother, ask anthropologists or something, but it's been deemed useful by humans to have this universalized store of value, whether it be in bank accounts and paper money, or gold, or food, or shells, or bottle caps, in the case of the fictional world of Fallout. So providing we continue agreeing that the bottle caps are valuable, look at my Bugatti. Okay, but there are actual reasons why we would build constructs around certain things, and there are reasons why certain things will make up what we consider to be money and not others. The ability to split it into smaller parts, the ability to not be forged, the ability to keep track of who owns what. All the crypto bros in the comments absolutely creaming themselves right now. Okay, but in the year of our Lord 2025, we all know, realistically, I'm going to have to talk about gender. So I apologise in advance. This is just what we're going to have to do now. So how the fuck is gender a social construct? What is a woman, one might say? Well, a woman, made up of a few traits, has large gametes, has soft skin, wide hips, has bobs, psychological things potentially as well, the internal experience of femininity. I don't have an internal sense of gender. I'm told people have them. I'm probably too autistic for it, to be honest. Put me in a dress, I wouldn't care. Do not do that. Reddit will not be... Go away. We could go on and on about all of these traits that make up what a woman is or a man is or whatever. So now let's say we remove one of those traits and then ask the question again, is this person a woman? So let's say they have some sort of chromosomal disorder. Are they still a woman? Almost definitely yes. If not, you're probably a Ben Shapiro, and there's no coming back from that, to be honest, I feel. Okay, so at some point we just keep stripping these things back. Let's say they don't have Vagooba anymore. Let's say they don't have Bobs. What are you even going on about, brother? If we just keep stripping these traits back, after a certain point, they no longer fit the category of woman. They no longer fit the construct of woman. So they're no longer a woman. If Matt Walsh by chance fucking lands on this video, but that is how words work. To illustrate the point further, at what point is this black and this white? More accurately, in the case of most categories, it's probably more like this, as we will get onto later, but you get the point. I will just say, before we go on, I really fucking hate this kind of language analysis, because it's kind of futile, as we will get into in examples later. Wittgenstein is in fact based. Okay, so when we start doing this, when we start stripping back the things and go, oh, is this a woman? The urge here is to go, no! It is just the gametes. It is just chromosomes. I swear to... That is what it is. I know what it is. I can see it. It is when they have pee-pee. See, now the problem is with dying on that hill, that's just like not how language works, as we illustrated with the gradient. But if we need some better examples, think again about Ben Shapiro. There is a famous clip of him on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Watch that show.
I've never watched that show either, but she's on the cover of Time magazine.
Oh.
Or he's on the cover of Time magazine.
Well, there was the woman in that show.
Because Benny Boy has decided in his autism-riddled brain, chromosomes are the only thing that defines a woman. And then when you look at this person and you go, he's at the point of latching onto this definition where he's no longer describing reality, to the extent to which he has to trick his brain to carry on dying on the hill. When using the term male and female, you're using something closer to the idea in the beginning of the cluster of traits, where there is sort of a web of things that make up womanliness and manliness, and if you fall into a certain number of these categories, arbitrarily defined by the human psyche, that is when you are that thing. In a famous example of this, the example of Diogenes the Cynic and Plato, where Plato is trying to describe human in the most minimal words possible, to which he goes, oh, bipedal and hairless, and Diogenes plucks a chicken raw and throws it into the academy, behold Plato's man, etc. Don't die on this hill. It's very silly. Okay, but stick with me, guys. I know I'm going on a bit here. Why is gender a social construct? On multiple levels, right? Why have we picked certain traits to define as male and female and not others? And also, why have we decided to define that thing, right? There are a bunch of hypothetical categories we could come up with based on physical realities, which we choose not to. So, for example, hair colour is not relevant to gender, really, unless you get like a sort of mauve finish that gradients out. There are even constructs that are useful in one setting, but not the other. For example, there are certain genes that control how likely you are to get Alzheimer's. We create a construct of people that are likely to get Alzheimer's in a medical setting, but not in a social setting, because who gives a fuck? So with those things, we could, let's say, make a green eyes and brown eyes group, or a likely to get Alzheimer's and not likely to get Alzheimer's group, and we could point to the thing and go, look, it is objective. What do you want about it socially? Like, it's not socially constructed because, look, they have brown eyes. What are you saying? Their eyes are not brown? It's like, no, that's not the point. The reason it's a social construct is because you've decided to label it. The construct is the labeling action, not the action of it being true. The problem is, this analysis kind of leaves out an important aspect here, which is certain things lend themselves to have constructs built around them versus others. And as I said, we will get to that in the second section. Let's do another example of stupidly dying on a hill. Graham Linehan, famous comedy writer and prolific tweeter, the final boss of divorcees, when asked to provide a definition of a chair, he gave some definitions like, can be sat on by a human, has 4 legs, something like this, to which someone responded with a picture of a horse. Stop dying on the hills, guys. This is not how language works. Stop. I know the instinct is there. This is why you need to stop going. Art is things that were painted before the year 1900. Gender is just chromosomes. This is not how language works. Please stop doing this. You look silly. But in fairness to the horses are chairs crowd, this is in response to what I think is a non-acknowledgement by a lot of the people who use this critique, the social construction critique, which is sort of leaving out the usefulness and the extent to which these categories are arbitrary versus defined by some sort of reality that we live in. So in the case of a chair, it's not entirely arbitrary that we would come up with the conception of a chair, because humans get tired and we want to sit down, so we just get a word for a thing that is for sitting on. And, you know, words have to be defined. So if you go on the Oxford Dictionary, you'll probably find a definition, which is probably where Graham Linehan got it. It'll be something like a seat designed for one person, commonly with 4 legs, something like this. But just know when you do this as your sort of metaphysic, that little autistic philosophers like myself will come along and go, well, look at the horsey. Do you think a pony is a chair? Okay, so let's just recap before we go to the next section. In short, things like gender are socially constructed because, 1, the traits that make up the definition are picked socially. So why is hair colour not relevant, but wide hips are? Because number 2, whether we decide to make a definition in the first place is defined socially. So why would we choose to define some things as male and female? Why would we create definitions of certain colours or people who are more likely to have Alzheimer's? And 3, the way we use language is not even like this. Again, Wittgenstein is correct. The way we use language is not like a computer. If has these lists of traits, then this. It's more like this has a sort of resemblance to a network of traits that appear to be male and female, or appear to be a certain gene expression, or whatever. Now, I've been very flippant in my very usual semi-humorous, cocky style, but there is something very funky going on here on the sort of pro-social construction philosophical side. So let's move on. Section 2. Why though? Why does music sound good? Was a question that was asked to me recently in a discussion about music theory. So now you have to listen to it too, boys. Immediate answer, given all the previous social construct stuff we've just talked about, is, well, I grew up in a culture that had certain preferences when it came to music, and I have sort of by osmosis taken in these ideas, and now perceptually find them appealing. So whatever I was exposed to when I was younger is kind of what I'm going to find appealing for most of my life going forward. This is true to an extent, but actually, it's not actually as arbitrary as that. So excluding sort of noise music or anything like that, nearly all music has three elements: melody, rhythm, and harmony. Some cultures will only do rhythm, some cultures will only do harmony, etc. But they all broadly have these traits. But interestingly, nearly every culture that has been studied that practices harmonic or melodic music will use very similar notes. What in Western music we would call octaves, perfect fifths, major thirds. Effectively, these are ratios of notes to another note. So if you take a frequency, let's say 440 hertz, which is how we tune the note A, usually, if you double that to 880 hertz, that's an octave. And if you play these two together, they sound very resonant. It's a 2-to-1 ratio of frequency. And likewise, if you do this with perfect fifths, which are a 3-to-2 ratio, or major thirds, which are 5-to-4, I did not calculate these. I could not be asked. There's something about the human ear and how we perceive sound that makes it so that we find these things enjoyable. So you're already thinking, mate, that's so kooky crazy. How is it that so many different cultures have all come to the same sort of tuning systems? We could do infinite numbers of frequencies, but they always use the same relative frequency. Yeah, okay, well, whatever. What's even kookier and crazier? Pretty much every sound that you hear, I think, I do not know how to research very well, will have what is called a fundamental frequency, which is the pitch that you perceive, and then a bunch of quieter, ever increasing in pitch overtones which accompany the sound. And these overtones will follow the same pattern of relative pitches, what we term the harmonic series, which is a 2-to-1 ratio, then 3-to-1, then 4-to-1, then 5-to-1. But the thing that is weird is that the ratios between these, so the first overtone to the second overtone, the second to the third, those ratios are the same ratios that we find pleasing. So it is an octave, 2-to-1, then it's a perfect fifth, 3-to-2, then a major third, and so on and so on. So seemingly, the pitches that humans find relatively enjoyable are baked into sound itself. Wow. So let's do a couple more examples of what I think seem arbitrary, but actually have fairly tangible reasons why they occur across cultures. We use what is called a base 10 numbering system, which is where we have 10 unique digits that we then make up the remainder of our counting system. From what I can tell, there's nothing mathematically valuable about this. We could use base 2 like computers do, where they only have 2 unique digits, or you can use base 8 or base 6. The commonly accepted reason that we've done this is because we have 10 fingers, so each digit is represented as a finger. Let's do another example. Language. If we were looking in the postmodern soup and we're like, language could be made up of any sound, right? Realistically, any sound that physics can create, we could make a language out of. But it isn't that, is it, right? It's limited to sounds that we can make with things that are on our body. But the reason I'm bringing up all these examples is because what's often happening, I find, when people talk about social constructs isn't simply a philosophical point about how language works. It serves as almost a way for people to say, well, it's all ultimately arbitrary and based on social groups anyway, so why do you even care that much? But for some, a good amount, of cases, this actually isn't true. There are actually tangible realities in which our social constructs are based on. So in the case of music, not only is it non-arbitrary in the sense that it's based on something more fundamental, pun intended, but also the fact that humans cross-culturally seem to be picking the same constructs in these cases implies that there is something very real about them, at the very least to humans. And that right there brings me on to the main point. What is bro waffling about? So what I'm really trying to do with this video is save the baby and throw out the bathwater when it comes to social constructs and whether that's a valid way to look at understanding the world. As previously stated, it feels almost like when people bring up social constructs, a lot of the time, they're doing it to almost discredit an idea or give it less force, let's say. But in reality, the force of a lot of definitions or constructs actually aren't from whether they're correct in some Platonic sense. It comes from sort of two things. One, which all philosophers who talk about social constructs will agree with, which is the usefulness of the ideas. So, in the case of money, it's quite useful, even if it isn't based on anything truly objective. And are the social constructs appearing regularly across cultures? And jumping off from that last one, is it based on some sort of observable underlying fact of the matter, like having 10 fingers or the way sound works, that could be seen as, oh, maybe that's why that is? And the latter there is really what I'm trying to hammer home in this video, and I'll hope to elucidate the reasons for caring about whether things appear cross-culturally in the last section here. Like, intellectually, we are looking at facts as if they're in a sort of sea of uniformity, but in reality, that's not how the human brain is perceiving things, right? So in the case of using certain metals to represent money historically, or in the case of using certain notes for music, or counting in certain ways, not only are these things all useful for various reasons, to pretend as if they're picked arbitrarily is to actually sort of understand reality less, because they are based on something that makes you think, oh yeah, of course humans would naturally come up with decimal counting systems, or naturally use metals that can be melted down easily and are quite rare to represent money, right? When you're sat in your armchair at home going, oh, why would people pick X thing? It's really easy to go, well, there's no reason that we should use gold instead of, tin or something. So, as I said, year 2025, we really here because gender, right? So why are male and female appearing cross-culturally? Firstly, because the traits that are associated with male and female cluster, right? So the fact that I have wider shoulders or have a deeper voice are not unrelated things. They appear in clusters across the human population, and for fairly understandable biological reasons, right? And humans ultimately are pattern recognizing machines. So if we start seeing loads of clusters of traits appear together, we're going to go, oh, this is a thing. The human instinct to categorize, let's say. Okay, but right, my viewers, being the hyper-intelligent individuals that you are already probably screaming at me, well, just because things cluster doesn't mean we should care about them, right? And you would be correct, right? So in the case of eye colour and skin colour, those things do cluster, but generally we don't make constructs around them. So, yeah, obviously, just don't do that, innit? Well, the first and probably main reason is, as all constructivists would agree with, is it useful? I would say having sex for both work and leisure is useful, so gender is useful on that level. And I would also, by extension, say that unless you're an antinatalist, the ability to identify what equipment someone has is quite valuable when it comes to identifying who you could have children with, let's say. This is obviously not the only function of gender, that it also exists for other fun reasons. But also you'll probably be saying, well, surely we can change the constructs, right? There's nothing that says we have to do it. Like in the case of many of these constructs, we absolutely can. Like in the case of music, we could just choose to widen our scale some more, or we could choose, as we actually do, by the way, in the case of a piano where everything's slightly out of tune, we don't perfectly hit those ratios, but it still sounds good, right? You can stretch the concepts to where you're no longer hitting what, let's say, the cross-cultural norm would be. For the rest of this section, when I'm talking about this, you just need to think, whenever I'm saying gender, I'm not talking about, like, whether I have short hair or not. I'm talking about sort of secondary sex characteristics. So, like, whether someone has breasts or wide shoulders or has masculine or feminine facial features, that sort of thing. Things that would hint to their equipment. It's actually, in most cases, probably more useful to put trans people into the category that they want to be identified as, right? But also, I'd say, it's also more correct in a lot of cases. So if you think back to the example of Benny Boy, when he's misgendering some trans people, because his brain is perceiving that person as, that is a fucking woman, and he's having to consciously overwrite that to sort of die on this hill, right? So why would it be useful to extend the definitions of gender to trans people? Well, mainly because it's better for them psychologically. And more importantly, it's also more correct oftentimes, like in the case of Shapiro, right? And like this really is where my progressive fans are going to get very upset with me here, right? And I'm going to get like lots of comments about this. I've just right there created a definition of gender that excludes quite a few trans people, right? Those people being people without gender dysphoria and people who might not pass as well. And like I have to say, like, yeah, unfortunately that is the case, right? The way that social constructs actually function is if you are not socially fitting that construct, then it's just not going to be perceived that way, right? And by extension of that, if you're not inhibiting the construct which you want to keep, then by definition, you're not part of that construct, right? Like, if I suddenly, over the course of this video, identified as a woman, it actually would be incorrect, right? It would be correct in the sense that you probably wouldn't know if I had some of the psychological features of womanhood, let's say, but it would be incorrect in the sense that I'm giving off all the signals that would imply I'm not part of that construct. Also, in the same token, I'm probably being quite a bit stronger on this than a lot of people would be, which is by saying a lot of trans people actually literally are the thing they're saying they are in most contexts. Now, obviously, you're going to be saying, well, you're just saying they don't fit the current construct, right? We can change the construct. And that really right there is kind of the point of this entire video. all the usefulness stuff is somewhat secondary in my mind to whether or not it actually is just going to happen. In the case of music, you might argue that one ought to treat all frequency ratios as the same, right? There's nothing ultimately that says that we are correct to define gender in this way or correct to define notes in this way. You might be fighting against a very deeply held human instinct. And the main bit of evidence that I'm using to argue this in the case of, let's say, gender or music or whatever, is the fact that they're appearing cross-culturally. As much as people would like to debate that in the case of gender, the fact that things are appearing consistently throughout culture has to be explained in some way, right? It can't simply be the case that by chance 90% of cultures on planet Earth that practice music in this way all use the same sort of ratios for notes, right? Or in the case of gender, that all cultures independently coming up with the same conceptions. And importantly here, it's not that it's based on some underlying biological reality that I think. It's likely more the case that there is something psychologically about humans that means that we care about some things more than others, or we are more liable to create constructs about some things versus others. If all humans are forming communities, whether it be tribes or full-on civilizations, it might not be wise to go, well, ultimately, the fact that we form a tribe is completely arbitrary. There's nothing that means that we ought to do that. There may be something in the human psyche that is preferentially creating constructs around things, and to sort of by default behave in accordance with them is probably a reasonably good strategy, right? The thing I'm talking about here, right, if you've ever seen those videos of the little pet beavers who will build dams with all of their toys, these beavers have never met another beaver or been in the wild. They just have a hardwired instinct to create dams, right? So if you were Beaver Judith Butler, you could be saying, well, ultimately, why do I need to build dams? What is so important about the construct of dams? But the fact that the beaver has an inner instinct to do that should be respected in some way, right? It's part of its nature to identify this. And I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that in animals that reproduce sexually, which we are part of, not that I would know, that there is almost necessarily going to be constructs around the ability to identify what equipment people have. Look, I feel like if we're allowing humans who are evolutionarily inclined to eat high-calorie foods, I feel like we can allow humans who are evolutionarily inclined to figure out who to shag. That's all I'm saying, really. And if you want evidence specific to this in the case of gender, you already sort of see this happening in the case of language that is used to discuss gender these days, right? I was recently filling in a form for the NHS, and it was asking me my sex assigned at birth, right? This new set of language to describe gender is sort of an implicit understanding of how these constructs are useful, right? The constructs are useful to predict certain biological things, like whether they can reproduce with them, or certain other biological realities, like the likelihood to get testicular cancer, let's say, or something like this, right? But it probably isn't useful in a lot of other contexts, right? In social contexts, it's just sort of irrelevant, and they are inhabiting all of the traits that would matter in that context, so they just are that thing, right? Like, in the case of Ben Shapiro, he is literally wrong, I think. A good example that my girlfriend uses when talking to sort of right-leaning people about social constructs is the idea of adoptive parents, right? Adoptive parents literally are parents, right? We treat them as such in almost all cases, but in some cases, the construct of biological parenthood is actually going to matter, right? Like in cases of donating organs or whatever it might be, right? You're basically going back to a construct that defines them as distinct in some way. We already have a term for this, right? It's trans woman or sex assigned at birth. What do you identify as? This is the same sort of language, right? You have a construct for work and play, let's say. This video realistically is more a video to myself as to sort of say, be less of an anti-realist about fucking everything. Because at one point in my life, I was sort of a gender abolitionist, right? This idea that male and female should just sort of be disposed with, they're arbitrary. And during the sort of widespread visibility of trans people, I was reflecting on gender and I was like, well, yeah, ultimately, why does gender matter? And then obviously usefulness, etc. And a lot of the arguments mentioned here, right? And this is the sort of mindset I'll no doubt be seeing in the comments as I'm speaking right now, this sort of, bro, just like let people live, why do you even care? And I just want to say as well, as a behavioural sort of thing, I would say you need to address people as they want to be addressed. Not only because it's literally true in many cases, like that person literally is a woman or literally is a man in the context in which it matters, but also from a usefulness perspective, right? And from a general, what is probably the best beliefs to push to society. Like, as much as these arguments are justifying a very controversial perspective amongst left-wing people, I genuinely want to say, like, I'm not coming at this from a perspective of, I find trans people upsetting in some way, right? The point of this is to simply figure out what is actually happening in regards to social constructs, right? Like, how is the world actually functioning? What is actually true? And I'm not saying what is actually true in like a turf way. What is the human brain doing, or how are human minds conceptualizing certain categories? Is it the case that categories are truly constructed arbitrarily in all cases? Or are there categories that humans have a very strong predilection towards? Which is what I've spent the past 45 minutes fucking waffling about. So, like, obviously, yes, I do think there are, right? Some constructs are just going to be very hard to get away from by the human mind. And to sort of not consider this fact in how you're constructing your views of the world, I think sets you up for failure more than it does anything else. This isn't me saying we ought to conceptualize gender in a certain way. It's to simply say that that is probably just what's going to happen, so we should behave in accordance with that. The thing is as well, right, I actually do feel that a lot of trans people I've spoken to actually would probably broadly agree with me here, in the sense that a lot of trans identity kind of relies on the fact that gender abolitionism isn't true. Like, the existence of top and bottom surgery is sort of tacitly admitting the fact that there are elements to gender which are sort of necessary perceptually to feel like that thing, to inhabit that thing. Okay, now that I've destroyed my entire fan base with that section, and just talk broadly about social constructs to finish this out. The key takeaway from this video is to say that the fact that cultures are creating constructs in a consistent manner about the same sorts of things should alone be used as evidence for the importance of those things, or that they are pointing to an underlying fact of the matter that is relevant to humans, an underlying fact of the matter about human perception, because it just would be very statistically unlikely for this to happen. And this is sort of a way for me to introduce this concept of what I call ape brain, which is a sort of way of understanding the world. What would my ape brain think about this, right? So in this case, if your argument about changing a thing is, well, it's a social construct, that probably isn't a good enough argument for the feasibility or reasonableness of changing a thing, given that basically everything is a fucking social construct. So the real mission from what I can see is to try to determine what things actually fit this category of ape brain and are sort of unavoidable aspects of human perception. What elements of gender truly are arbitrary, like the pink and blue, let's say. What elements of art and culture truly are universal and could point to some sort of aesthetic realness, if we're going to use that term. And one of the big tools that we can use to figure out what that is this kind of, does this appear cross-culturally, right? This is sort of the main arguments that do get used for deconstructing certain social constructs, is that, well, X culture does not do it, so why should we? But if all cultures do it, we can't really use the argument if nearly all the cultures do it. I mean, there's always going to be exceptions to a rule, right? If even we had like a 60-40 split of a certain cultural phenomenon over time, I think that would be enough to investigate and to see if it's some part of the human condition, right? And this is definitely not to say we should never modify social constructs. We can avoid being me as a gender abolitionist or Ben Shapiro, which I feel is probably a reasonable goal to try achieve in one's life. Anyway, hope you enjoyed.